Good morning. Today we're beginning on page 32, the sight edge, starting in the section in the pail. Two frogs left the safety of their swamp one day. Oh, and this is the second story that he began to read. Two frogs left in the safety of their swamp one day and ventured into a nearby farm to explore. Soon they found themselves in a dairy where they found a large milk pail. Hopping into the pail, they found it was half filled with fresh cream. The two little frogs were absolutely thrilled. They had never tasted anything so delicious. Soon their bellies were full. Feeling sleepy, they decided it was time to leave, and that's when they realized that they were in trouble. They'd had no trouble hopping in, but how were they going to get out? The inside of the pail was too slippery to climb, and because they couldn't reach the bottom and there was nothing for them to step on for traction, hopping to safety was out of the question too. They were trapped. Frantic, they began thrashing about, their feet scrabbling for a foothold on the elusive, slippery curb of the pail's sides. Finally, one frog cried out, "It's no use, we're doomed." "No," the other frog gasped. "We can't give up. When we were tadpoles, could we have dreamed that someday we would emerge from the water and hop out onto land? Swim on, brother, and pray for a miracle." Good morning, Kara. But the first song only eyed his brother sadly. "There are no miracles in the life of a frog," he croaked. "Farewell," and he sank slowly out of sight. The second frog refused to give up. He continued paddling in the same tiny circle over and over, hoping against hope for a miracle. An hour later, he was still paddling in his futile little circle. He no longer even knew why. His brother's dying words clutched at his thoughts as fatigue tugged at his tiny muscles. Was my brother right? He thought desperately. Are there no miracles in the life of a frog? Finally, he could swim no more. With a whimper of anguish, he stopped paddling and let go, ready to face his fate. But by this time, the boy was no longer reading. Unable to keep his eyes open any longer, he had fallen fast asleep as the frog paddled in his desperate circle, refusing to give up. Somewhere in the back of his mind, though, the boy had already guessed how the tale of the two frogs would turn out, and his guess was pretty much the way the story's last paragraph did in fact read. Yet to his surprise, unlike his brother, the second frog did not sink. In fact, he stayed right where he was, as if suspended in midair. He stretched out a foot tentatively and felt it touch something solid. He heaved a big sigh and a silent farewell to his poor departed brother frog, then scrambled up onto the top of the big lump of butter he had just churned, hopping out of the pail and off toward his home in the swamp. That night, the boy dreamed of frogs paddling on a bed of flowers, floating on a pond of pennies. The wealthy man's other son lay awake that night too, but he never opened his copy of the storybook their father had given them. He was too busy thinking to sleep or read. He'd made his decision the moment his father held out that sheaf of $1,000 bills. He was already making big plans for his next 31 days. When morning came, he sprang into action. After notifying his father of his choice, he opened his $1 million line of credit at his father's bank. Next, he hired an executive director to help him execute his ambitious plan, and the two rented out a hotel suite in the center of town, where they conducted interviews for the next 6 days. By the week's end, they had hired a staff of the sharpest financial advisors, market analysts, and investment experts available. The group spent the second week researching, brainstorming, and drafting strategies to help the wealthy man's son transform his $1 million windfall into a genuine fortune. By the beginning of week 3, they were locked and loaded and ready to rumble, and off they marched into the battlefields of commerce and speculation to turn the boy's millions into billions. A few days later, the boy decided to pay a visit to his brother to see what he was doing with his million. But when he arrived, he found to his astonishment that his brother had turned down the million and taken the penny instead. "I went to see father again the day after we all met," the first boy told his brother, "and his butler gave me a peek into the purse. My lone penny had been joined by a companion. On the third day, I went back and peeked in again and now saw 4 pennies. On the 4th day, there were 8. The brother listened in disbelief as the boy continued describing his insignificant little pile of pennies. On day 8, there had been 16 pennies. On day 6, 32. And by the week's end, the boy had amassed a whopping nest egg of 64 cents. By the end of the second week, the cache of pennies was just shy of $90, $81.92 to be precise. Not even enough to pay for a decent dinner for two at the hotel where his brother's Ace financial team had their base of operations. Now, a few days into the third week, the purse had grown to $655.35, barely enough to sustain the boy on his own for a week. "You poor sap," cried his brother. "I can't believe you went for the penny. But it's not too late. Visit our father, see if he'll let you change your mind. Even if he gives you only half of your million, it's certainly better than scraping by on what you've got now. Or at least let me help. I can't stand the idea of you venturing out into the world with scarcely enough to feed yourself for a week." But the first boy wouldn't hear it. That night, the old man died peacefully in his sleep. Toward the end of the month, the second boy's executive director brought him some worrisome news. The markets had gone a bit soft, and the team's earlier rosy projections would need to be revised downward. The boy thanked them and waited anxiously for the next report. On the morning of day 31, the day on which the boys were to visit the butler and finally receive their purses, the executive director came back with his final report. He shuffled his feet and cleared his throat for a minute, asked for a glass of water, and then began his report by saying that the news was mixed. Some investments had performed quite well, others had suffered. All in all, the boy had made a modest gain. The team had succeeded in parlaying his 1 million into nearly 1.5 million, an appreciation of 50%. That was the good news. And the bad news? The boy held his breath. "Well, continued his executive director, expenses, including the team's commission, taxes, broker fees, interest on the credit line, the bill for the hotel suite." He cleared his throat again, took a sip of water, and continued. "And of course, my salary for the month come to just over 1.75 million. The boy was 250,000 in the red. Now only was he not rich, he actually owed a fortune. He was ruined. In a panic, he rushed across town to see his brother, and this time he received an even larger shock than the first time he'd gone to visit. On day 28, the first boy's purse of pennies had passed the $1 million mark. And on day 29, the $2.5 million mark. Yesterday, on day 30, it had exceeded 5 million. And today, when the butler handed him his purse over to his own care, it had topped out at $10,737,418.24. The boy who chose to wait for the penny had discovered the extraordinary power that some call the eighth wonder of the world, the remarkable creative force of compound interest. The very same force that blanketed the pond surface with water hyacinth and churned the frog's cream into butter. The boy who chose the million was broke and deeply in debt. The boy who chose the penny was worth more than $10 million. The Millionaire's Mom. I know. The story of the two sons is only a fable. Over here in real life, there's no butler doubling your money every day for a month. Over here in real life, though, things work out that way a lot more than you might think. I'll give you a true life example. Rosemary Olson, my mom. My mom worked as an administrative assistant in our church for 35 years. Pay was minimal, and the job didn't exactly come with a lot of benefits. And if life was hard, it got a lot harder when my father died. My dad served in World War II and came home with some health problems that never fully resolved. After 20 years or so of not working, working for the Veterans Administration, he ended up getting to know the VA hospital from the customer's point of view. He had lost a lung to emphysema and eventually succumbed to a heart attack at the ripe old age of 41. At the military ceremony, they did that thing you've probably seen on television, where they fold an American flag down into a neatly creased triangle, walk solemnly over, and hand it to the oldest son. In this case, that happened to be me. I was 11 years old. From that point on, my mother was a single mom, raising a family of 3 kids. She worked, she came home, she cooked, she took care of us. She never drank, never cussed, never complained. Not once, not ever. And she was always there for me, no matter what. She was so consistent that later on in life, I took to calling her matter of fact Rose. For my part, I have to admit that I more or less took all of this for granted. I knew that my mom had grown up with little money, and that's how my siblings and I grew up, in a house with little but the bare essentials. In my mind, that's just how things were. And it's easy to assume that just how things are is how they're always going to be. Fast forward to many years later after I had built some success in my life. In 1996, a book appeared titled The Millionaire Next Door by Thomas J. Stanley and William D. Danko. A classic today, Stanley and Danko's book is still the best description I've ever read of how real life people have become wealthy by following slight edge principles. The millionaires featured in their book don't inherit their wealth or strike it rich by making outrageously lucky gambles. They don't live large, drive flashy cars, or live in ostentatious homes. They live below their means and make sensible, smart choices in how they conduct their everyday lives. After that book came out, my friends would tell me, "Hey, Jeff, have you seen this book? It's about you. It describes exactly what you do and how you act. You're the millionaire guy next door." Sure enough, the book described exactly how I approached my finances. For years, I kept our family living on $4,000 a month, no matter how much my income increased, and I wouldn't let us raise that monthly threshold until I had $1 million after taxes in the bank. Then I raised it to 5,000. Some years later, I was sitting with my mom one day and happened to tell her about the book and about what my friends were saying about me being the steady as she goes, one foot in front of the other, nothing flashy, millionaire next door guy. She nodded and then said, "You know why that is?" "No," I replied, not sure where she was going with this. "Why?" She looked at me and said, "Well, I'm a millionaire too." "What do you mean?" I said. "You mean the house or?" There was no way her house would be worth $1 million, not even at an inflated 1996 market values, and I knew that. But I couldn't imagine what else she could possibly mean. "No," she said, "I have a couple $1 million, salted away, in savings." "What?" I just stared at her. "I have a couple $1 million too," she repeated. Seeing my astonished expression, she shrugged and added, "It's not something you'd want to brag about." For all these years of going to work every day, going about her life, taking care of her kids, living in that little house, she had been quietly saving, consistently and persistently. Without anyone else noticing, she had quietly made herself into a millionaire, literally. The power that covered the pond with water hyacinth, that churned the frog's cream into butter, that turned the first son's penny into millions, is the same power that turned my mom's hard-earned paychecks into millions. That power is what this book is about. Although completely unaware of it, I'd been living with a picture-perfect example of the slight edge my whole life. All right, we will stop there for today. We are on page 37, and tomorrow we'll start with the cost of waiting. Thank you all. Have a good day.